Are there any further speakers?
Speaker.
I call in Lees-Galloway.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's a pleasure to rise on behalf of the Labour Party and speak in support of the Trade Safeguard Measures Bill. Mr Speaker, this is, as with many trade bills, this is a bill which has received bipartisan support from across the House. In fact, it was originally introduced by the Honourable Leanne Dalzell during the last Labour government. I think that does require a comment to note that it seems to have taken an awfully long time for this government to progress the bill. If it was introduced by the previous government, that at least 4 years later, here we are just in the second reading of the bill. Mr Speaker, the purpose of the bill is to replace New Zealand's current safeguards regime with a new regime that is consistent with World Trade Organisation rules. New regime will be a more efficient, transparent and objective investigative and decision-making process. Safeguards are emergency measures applied at New Zealand's border, usually in the form of a duty, and facilitate adjustment by a domestic industry to competition from increased imports. That's, I suppose, a flowery way of saying it's a response to dumping, the practice of dumping large quantities of often low-quality, low-cost goods on a particular market, and this is the regime by which New Zealand will be able to defend its borders against such exercises. So the existing Act, the Temporary Safeguard Authorities Act 1987, was subject to a review under the Labour-led government, which included wide public consultation, and the bill is the result of that work. So again, I note that a lot of the work, a lot of the consultation, a lot of the activities which take time in preparing a bill were carried out by the previous government. So again, the question remains, why, when this is such an important piece of legislation to support the work of small businesses and large businesses across New Zealand, to support our own local economy and to safeguard our own local economy, the question has to be asked, why on earth has it taken this government such an astonishingly long time to progress the bill to the point where it's at second reading? Now, the bill not only ensures compliance with World Trade Organisation rules, it streamlines the process of responding to allegations of dumped or subsidised goods on the New Zealand market, something that will certainly be welcomed by New Zealand manufacturers and New Zealand producers. It removes the requirement to establish temporary safeguard authorities, and it enables the existing expertise of the Ministry of Economic Development to be utilised instead. So it is a cost-effective measure too, and we're all supportive of that, Mr Speaker. The bill is timely, as it is important that at the time when domestic spending is constrained in New Zealand, that we have the right tools to protect our businesses from the impacts of globalisation and increased competition where appropriate. Now, Mr Speaker, this is of course one part of ensuring that the New Zealand economy is able to compete fairly in the world market, and it's great that we're able to put these measures in place to protect and support New Zealand manufacturers and to protect and support New Zealand producers. But what those manufacturers and producers will really be looking for, Mr Speaker, is a real plan, a real economic plan from this government. Not 120 points of nothingness, not a 14-point this and a 6-point that, and goodness knows what other plans and bullet points will be introduced by this government as they seek any opportunity they have to try and convince New Zealand that there is a plan. We don't need bullet points, we don't need statements. What New Zealand actually needs to make our economy stronger, to ensure that we can compete internationally, to ensure that our exports are of value and recognised and valued by markets overseas. What we need is an economic plan from this government. And I think it is reflective. It is reflective of how sluggish and how lamentably poor this government has been at driving our economy out of the recession that it has been in, that this fundamental piece of trade legislation has languished for such a long time, 4 long years, if not more, Mr Speaker, since it was first introduced. It was introduced by a Labour government, it was progressed by a Labour government, but it all came to a grinding halt once National got into power. Mr Speaker, some significant changes are certainly proposed by the bill. I've mentioned the safeguard interventions which will be undertaken by the Ministry rather than by independent temporary safeguard authorities, and the extension of the current 30 working day time frame for the completion of a safeguard investigation. That will now be extended to 75 working days, or in fact even 85 days if provisional safeguard duties are requested. The bill provides that after receiving the Chief Executive's report about a safeguard investigation, the Minister may take one or more of the actions in relation to imported goods if the Minister is satisfied that a range of criteria have been met. Mr Speaker, given that this is the second reading, it is worth reflecting on some of the amendments offered up by the Select Committee. The first of those is around the provisional safeguard duty termination or reduction. As introduced, Clause 15 of the bill would provide the Minister with a wide-reaching discretionary power to terminate or reduce a provisional safeguard duty. The Select Committee considered that this power was too wide and should be subject to a parameter of compliance, and recommended an amendment to Clause 15(1) to limit the Minister's discretion to terminate a provisional safeguard measure by requiring that Minister be no longer satisfied that be no longer required to terminate a provisional safeguard measure by requiring that the Minister be no longer satisfied that there were reasonable grounds for believing that the conditions that justified imposing a provisional safeguard duty are met. The Select Committee also recommended an amendment to Clause 15(1) to limit the Minister's discretion to reduce a provisional safeguard duty by requiring that the Minister be satisfied that there are good reasons for doing so. The Select Committee also made amendments on the types of safeguard measures that are available and recommended the deletion of Clause 17D, which provides that a safeguard measure can consist of any other action that the Minister considers appropriate. The Select Committee considered that the types of safeguard measures in Clause 17A to C are comprehensive and likely actions other than those provided for in the bill, such as the monitoring of particular imports by the Ministry of Economic Development, would not require legislative authority. The Select Committee also recommended an amendment to Clause 17B to delete the words "or an exemption from the treaty" because there is no case in which a safeguard measure could be an exemption from a duty under the Tariff Act 1988. Mr Speaker, it's a reasonably technical bill, as often these trade bills are, but as is so often said in this House, trade being so fundamentally important to our economy as a small nation, reliant on primary produce and manufacturing, Mr Speaker, getting these technical bills around trade and ensuring that where possible we are consistent with the World Trade Organisation, they are fundamentally important to the growth and development of our economy and our ability to compete internationally. Now, the government, the National Party, they talk a good game on this stuff, but the fact remains that a bill like this being allowed to languish for so long, we're in the second term of this government. It was not a bill that was introduced by this government, it was introduced by the previous government. They had plenty of time to progress a technical bill like this, which is just so fundamentally important to ensuring that the New Zealand economy is robust, and in fact would have been extremely useful in times of low spending and times of recession in New Zealand. It would have been very useful for this bill to have been implemented 2 or 3 years ago. I think producers and business people in New Zealand would have appreciated that, but no, because this government can talk a good game on business, but when it actually comes to getting on with the job of being in government, they fail again, And New Zealand businesses are starting to wake up to this. They're starting to realise that this is the second and final term of this national government because, quite simply, Mr Speaker, they do not have a plan for our economy.
Call Stephen Browning.